what's turning you on this week? Emily, what do you got for us?
Yeah, well, I have a book because that's usually what my recommendations are. It's called Pleasure Activism. It's by Adrienne Marie Brown. And it is a Black, queer, feminist, womanist idea of pleasure and the ways that pleasure and politics work together. And I want to recommend specifically in that some erotic poetry. I think that poetry and words really capture my sexual experience as well. There's something like that was easy to sneak as a child growing up in, religious purity culture. And I still find a lot of meaning and value in them. Like I love the way that poets play with words in erotic poetry, the same way that people play with bodies and each other or themselves in pleasurable sexual experiences. So that's my first recommendation.
Awesome. Well, yeah, talking about pleasure, talking about the way our sexuality impacts our society and our politics. I mean, today of all days, I think that that's incredibly clear. And then talking about how sexy words can be. I wanted to take this opportunity to tell folks about what's turning me on this week, which is something called SlutBot. SlutBot, if you're not familiar, is a AI that you can access through text messaging as a way to learn how to sext, I guess you could say. It's a opportunity to have like sexting and these sexually charged conversations with an AI. And, I get what you're thinking. It's maybe not like the best dirty talk on the internet. I definitely think that longtime fans of the show will know that that is going to come from our incredible phone sex operators and erotica and all of these other wild things. But I really want to encourage people to check out SlutBot at juiceboxit.com. We'll have links to all these recommendations and things at the end of the show in the show notes. But I think that SlutBot is a incredible idea, Emily, because it is a way for people to maybe try on a sexual identity or try out some of their dirty talk and do so in a really safe environment. A lot of folks, especially if you are coming out of religion and maybe you feel like you're behind and you're not hip to all the cool kids lingo, this is a great opportunity in a safe environment where you're not really going to embarrass yourself in front of a silly robot to just try things on and see what it fits, whether that is a new pet name or perhaps even a different gender presentation or all of these different kinds of ideas. Definitely something I'd encourage folks to take a look at.
I love that. What a great use of technology, right? Like if a robot is consenting, if the AI is consenting,
right? Yeah.
Try everything.
Yeah, this specific clip of me promoting this idea may be the reason that I'm executed when our robot overlords inevitably take over the world. But for now, I would definitely encourage anybody who is maybe a little squeamish about their sexuality to check it out. But to that end, Emily, we have certainly talked about purity culture a lot on this show. But for folks who are new to that concept, how do you define that idea of purity culture?
Yeah, my ideas and experience are centered around the ideas of American purity culture, which are certainly influenced by Christianity in America. And they are profoundly identified with patriarchal, heteronormative, and even capitalist ideas of people and values and experiences. So my friend Emily Joy, who's written a book called Church 2, defines purity culture as the idea that sex and sexual experiences and even emotional experiences around sex should only be contained in an idea of a specific type of marriage that involves one man and one woman for life, and that's it. So I know a lot of people have experienced different forms of those ideas and in different ways. And it certainly touches, our own ideas of gender and our experiences of ourselves, as well as social circles and communities. But that's kind of where my experience and understanding of purity culture comes in, is that like very American, very modern, 80s and 90s on ideas of purity, this idea that certain people are good or valuable, and that someone could lose their value based on their experiences, or even their own sexual being in a context for not being right.
Yeah, and I think that it can be really tempting to believe that, like, all right, if you're watching this show, if you are part of the Atheist Community of Austin, whether as a viewer or a member, check out our website for membership details, that, you've walked away from religion, like you're done. You figured out there's no God, and huzzah for you. But what does it actually mean to start to deconstruct some of these ideas?
Mhm. Yeah, I think part of deconstruction for me involves like an intellectual critique, right? Which
Mm,
I think people are really good at, especially in their communities. Once you've deconstructed this idea of God or theocracy in general, then it's easy to think like I've done my work. But there's all these sneaky ideas that come in, I think, especially in America and especially in more conservative parts of the country,
mhm.
that linger and that take a little more attention. And I see deconstruction as sort of a process that is ongoing, right? Like it's not something that you just do and it's over and you're good now. Like these ideas that are insidious of power over others, or heteronormative ideas of gender or interactions between people, they really will continue to show up throughout your life. And so
Mm.
I think of deconstruction as paying attention to something, having that intellectual piece, and then also being really willing to work it out in relationships. Like, how do you address it when it comes up again in your community that you're in right now, or in a relationship you have with another person, or even in your relationship with yourself?
Yeah, some of these ideas are so insidious. And that's by design. We talked a couple of months ago with the show's founder, Dr. Dale Ray, about sort of the political history and some of the media and things that was coming out, particularly in the 90s and the early aughts, around a lot of these ideas. But they have now sunk so deeply into our culture that they show up without us even really realizing it. And so it's not the case that you can just say that I've walked away from it. If you're not actively working to deconstruct them on a regular basis, they're going to continue to show up, I believe.
Mhm. Yeah, they're ideas that are going to continue to cause harm, to you individually and to your community, unless you're sort of aware of them, learning new ways they might sneak into your life or show up in your own ideas, and really taking positions on them. That's something that I encourage people to do a lot, right? Like we can't eliminate a lot of things from our lives, but we can take positions on them. How
Mm-hmm.
much do we want to engage with, and what would we prefer to stand against? Right? Like that we all have agency within our own circles to continue to address these ideas when they show up, and to never consider this work finished because of the society and culture that we're in.
Absolutely. Well, some of the basic ideas about sex that I wanted to break down tonight are first and foremost that masturbation interferes with sexuality. I think that's a really persistent idea in our culture. I also wanted to talk about virginity, or the idea that sex like changes you, as well as the notion that sex needs love, or love requires sex, and those two things are necessarily like bonded together. Is there anything that you would add to that list?
Yeah, I'm also thinking about an idea that comes up for me, that like deconstruction means the opposite of something,
Mm,
and that sex needs to be at a certain frequency or engaged in a certain way in order to be valid in this like deconstructed place. Yeah.
yeah. Well, so let's start breaking some of these things down. I mean, number one, the idea that masturbation interferes with sex. How do you respond to that idea?
I mean, I feel like that was something that was very, like it was just very ingrained in me from an early age, right?
Mm,
That like pleasure within your own body, within your own choice or experience, was like the ultimate no, right? It was like something that only God would know, and therefore was like the most devastating to you as a person.
yeah. When you sin against your own body, you sin in like the most severe or profound ways, according
Mhm.
to the Christian scripture.
Right. And I think that ends up even outside of, even if you claim to be outside of a religious context, that can look like a lot of disgust towards one's own body or genitals. It can look like a lot of just avoidance, or like this idea that like your body is dirty and requires a certain, like, I don't know, segment of cleaning or of avoidance in order to like be made good, or, you know, that we should just sort of minimize the experience of like masturbation or pleasure.
Yeah, or even the idea that we need to modify our bodies. You know,
Mhm.
whether we are talking about circumcision, which is widely practiced in the United States, or a lot of other religious ideas around clitorectomies and some of these like really insidious notions, as if masturbation is bad for you in some
Mhm.
way. Or something that I hear frequently is that he masturbates too much, and so he doesn't have enough desire. Like he is not saving his sexuality for his wife, is often how it's framed, which I think ignores the fact that one, masturbation is sex. It
Mhm.
is sex and it is valid in its own right. Full stop. Masturbation is sex. So masturbation cannot interfere with sex. And I think that that is such an important message.
Mhm.
The other piece of that is that, yeah, particularly when we're talking about penises, we are all at least somewhat subject to the tyranny of hydraulics. You know, maybe there are only so many erections or orgasms that are available in a day. But you said something before the show about how pleasure begets pleasure and avoidance begets avoidance, and I thought that was incredibly profound. What more
Mhm.
can you say on that?
Yeah, I think it's something that I've, you know, recognized from my training in clinical psychology, that, you know, as we're talking about human sexuality, right? Like we're also talking about patterns of behavior. And patterns of behavior tend to continue. Um, you know, not all the time, not in all ways, but if you have more experience with something, it's going to be easier to continue in that same way. Like our brains are set up with these complex systems of reinforcements and you know, things that sort of like discourage us from continuing in certain ways. And I think that shows up a lot with sex, because sex involves so many biological and chemical processes.
Mm-hmm.
And it tends to happen that when, you know, people are sort of avoiding sexual experiences or sexual pleasure, or just even focusing on sensations involved with sex, that those patterns kind of continue. So pleasure is something you can actually grow and develop as a biological skill of connection and noticing and attention and experience. And avoidance, the same way, is also something that will continue in certain ways because it's reinforced over and over again.
Yeah, well, I love these ideas, and I know that we could, you know, this is Dr. Daryl Ray's show, so we could talk about masturbation for the next hour and a half, and have a really great show. But let's move on to talk about virginity, or maybe the idea that sex changes you as a person. How do you react to that notion?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, like, as someone who is a woman and experienced life in religious culture as a woman, right? Virginity was the most important thing about me,
Mm.
right? That the absence of something in my life or experience was actually central to my whole identity. And when I was deconstructing that idea and have continued to deconstruct it, um, I think I really came up with this idea, right? Like, I love the phrase that people are using, sexual debut, right? That there's maybe experiences that start at a certain time in your life, but that doesn't make them more or less a part of your identity. That it's just like, oh, I started this thing at a certain time and I had these experiences, you know, at this point. But I think the idea that there's something fundamentally about a person that changes with any specific act of their body is incredibly dangerous, because we know how many people don't get to have choice in their first sexual experiences, or you know, just face a lot of discomfort, or maybe they're not interested in sexual experiences the same way as, you know, some other people are. And in order to treat all of those identities and experiences with the amount of care that they deserve, we have to remove this idea that like sex could change you on a fundamental level.
Yeah, no, I think those are incredibly important ideas. And I'm definitely locking away the phrase sexual debut because, right, you can debut a lot of different practices. We can demystify our sexuality and we can take like vaginal, like penis in vagina intercourse off the table and say that that's no longer the holy grail of sexuality with all of the bullshit patriarchal baggage that comes along with that notion. And we can say like, all right, so maybe this was my intercourse debut, maybe this was my anal debut, maybe this was my debut trying out kink or some of these other ideas, and maybe take some of like the steam or the pressure away from this idea that on your wedding night you have to have penis and vagina sex in order for sex to have happened or to count.
Right. Yeah, that idea of only specific things counting is really, really destructive, I think, to people that, especially people who, if you grew up in a religious community, you may have had very few sexual experiences. You may still not be having the kind of sexual experiences that you hope for in your life right now, but that doesn't mean you're any less of a sexual being or someone who has a right to your own experiences or your own pleasure versus someone else who maybe has had a different level of experience or engaged with sex in their own way at a different point in their life.
Yeah, or even just the notion that somebody who's had more sex than you is somehow maybe better at sex or is perhaps broken in some way. I mean, sure, practice, practice, practice can definitely make your sexuality better, but a lifetime of continuous mediocre sex does not make you a good lover. And I think that we can demystify that a little bit by getting away from this idea that sex changes you in some like spiritually significant kind of way.
Hmm. Yeah. And the idea that I grew up with was that you could look at someone and tell whether or not they were having sexual experiences, right?
Oh,
Like it was a
sure.
way to like visually
That like Christian witchcraft kind of thing.
right? Like I know people who like they didn't if they were waiting to have sex in their idea till their wedding night, right? They wouldn't see anybody, the day after the wedding because they were embarrassed at how different they would probably look to their
Mm.
friends and family because now they had achieved something and it like reshaped their physical features in some way.
Yeah, I feel like there was an episode of like the Cosby Show or some similar family sitcom where the mother insisted that she could like smell sex on non-virgins. And as like a 8 or 9 year old who was just coming online to the notion that sex existed, I wasn't really worried about that. I was concerned about that for a way too long of a time. So let's talk a little bit about the idea that sex and love go together. That you can only have sex with people that you love deeply, or that if you love somebody, that you would have sex with them, and that love and sex are these things that we equate with one another, and that if one is missing, then the other must not be valid. How do you react to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just another like just a really toxic idea to me, right? Like it just removes so many people's valid experiences from their own control. The idea that, right, you would have to love someone or be with them in a certain way, be committed to them in order to enjoy sex, I think prohibits a lot of people from having enjoyable sexual experiences. And this idea that, like, love and sex are always paired, right? There's some interesting biology related to like sex can be one way to have some good feelings towards another person. And that's a valid experience, but it doesn't have to come that way, right? And anytime we're saying, like, well, this is the norm for everyone, we're eliminating a lot of people from their own experiences.
Sure. I mean, we're clearly excluding people who are asexual or are aromantic and these kinds of ideas, while also doing a lot of harm to really loving and beautiful and committed relationships because sometimes our bodies just aren't operating on a sexual wavelength. Sometimes we're just not hungry. And that doesn't mean that we care about our partners any less, whether that is one night of too much drinking and sex doesn't happen. And now there's all this anxiety about, well, I thought we were having a good time. Or on a more long term kind of situation, maybe there are some chronic health issues or a just completely unexplainable but absolutely valid lack of appetite. None of that means that your love is any less committed or that your passion for your partner is any less valid or important.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of medications, right? Or you said like illnesses that impact sex drives. And that's one of the things that I, try to be really supportive with people on is that your relationship, whether or not it contains sex at the frequency that you like at that moment, one, it may be just temporary, it may be more long term. There's probably some things we can do or that you can get support with from doctors or mental health professionals to work on the things that you would like to change in your relationship. And
I
then
think
there's
that's a
this idea
great thing
that,
to highlight. I apologize for
yeah.
interrupting you, but it's all about the things that you would like to change, not the things that you are obligated to change or the things that are wrong with you, just things that you might prefer to be different, which is valid too.
That's a great thing I think to work out, in therapy or in a sort of in a safe place where you can really talk about these are my desires. This is what I wish was different, with myself or with my partners, and then how to navigate that all together out in the open. Because there's a lot that can change, right? It might take some effort. It might take some like learning how to practice something different or in a way that you didn't expect, but pleasure is available to you. And
Mm-hmm.
sex in a way that works for you is available to you, whether or not there's love there in the way that society might deem as important or valid.
Yeah, well, and I feel like all of this bleeds in really well to something you highlighted, which is the idea that sex needs a certain frequency in order to be valid. What do you mean by that myth, and how do you react to it?
Yeah, I think this is something that's sort of come from my experience of working with people who grew up in religious contexts where sex was, something that was not experienced or that was very shamed, or incredibly restricted to specific scenarios. And I think out of that can, in deconstructing that, there can be this idea that sex should happen all the time, or that sex, needs to be in a certain way, or when you deconstruct these ideas, you don't necessarily have to then believe that only the opposite is valid, right? That your sexuality is valid and important, whether you're having a lot of sex and you love that or whether you're not. And so I think particularly in relationships, like it can be very destructive to say like, well, our relationship is struggling because we're not having sex. That may be the case. And that may be something you want to discuss with your partner or partners and someone who's trained in having these conversations well. But also, you can have a great long-term stable relationship with partners and have that not involve sex all the time.
Yeah, fair to say.